there's much truth in saying actually the Septuagint translation paved the way for Christianity.
Welcome to Kedem, and I am very glad to host today Professor James Aitken, Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
You are one of the most renowned experts in the Second Temple Judaism. And I have a very simple question, actually. What is a Septuagint?
The Septuagint is not an easy question to answer, although it sounds very simple. The Septuagint is a modern term for an ancient set of translations. These are the translations of the Hebrew Bible into Greek and some additional works which were either translated from Hebrew or Aramaic or written in Greek originally. So the Septuagint refers to this modern collection, but the collection didn't exist in antiquity. The ancient Hebrew writings were translated gradually over a long period of time. We call it the Septuagint because Septuagint means 70, referring to a legend of 70 translators.
Yeah, I think we are quite familiar with this legend, but from the academic point of view, what's behind this legend? Was it real, the miracle that 70 or 72 people translated this text and they all came out with the same result? What is the historic background?
Yes, this legend actually has a real power and influence because it's been copied in Jewish, Christian and even Muslim circles about this miraculous translation. We know about it in the Talmud, for example, where 70 translators gathered in 70 separate cells and remarkably through divine gift were able to translate the Bible exactly the same even though they were working separately. The origins of the legend started in the late 2nd century BC, where we have a document called the Letter of Aristeas. And then it was continued by Philo, and Philo was the one who really talked about the miraculous elements and the separate cells of translators all producing the same translation. The reason it started is very interesting because the late 2nd century BC is already 1.5 centuries after the translation had been started. And so it reflects perhaps a desire at that time period to give a status to the translation which was already being used. The Letter of Aristeas is a document which actually covers many different things, and the translation is only a small part of it. So we can see Aristeas creating this story about the translation to justify the Jews of Alexandria, because Aristeas argues that the librarian in Alexandria was asked by the king Ptolemy in Ptolemaic Egypt to provide a translation of all the known literature, including the literature of the Jews, which they didn't have in the library. So the king sanctions it. He brings over the Jewish elders from Jerusalem, and they show off their learning to the king. And then he declares all Jews in his kingdom may be free for this great gift of the translation which the Jewish elders have produced. By legend, there are 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, so that created the number 72, but it's then merged with other traditions about 70. So we can see in Aristeas something very interesting going on. It's not really about the translation, it's about the Jewish community in Alexandria, and it's a statement that the Jews in Alexandria need a translation, and that translation has come about through recognition, patronage and support of the King Ptolemy. So it's a statement about the learning of Jews, about their royal support, and about how they are at the center of the Ptolemaic kingdom by giving a translation to the library, which was the heart of the kingdom. So that's a legend, and the legend explains why this whole tradition came about. And I think part of it is also to establish the translation as a piece of ancient literature. which brings us to what is the reality behind all of this. Well, when we actually look at the Septuagint, and let's just begin with the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, which were the first texts translated. When we look at them, they're not written in the highest level of literary Greek. They're written in a rather more vernacular, everyday kind of Greek, with some literary flourishes. So immediately, one can understand that Jews in Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century were reading their translation and thinking, actually, this is not as good as literature elsewhere in Egypt, not as good as the Greek literature. Let us create a legend to raise the status and the literary standing of the translation. It is so good, it must be in the library. In terms of what we know about the date and location, the date of the first translations of the Pentateuch, we can say, are 3rd century BCE. We know this because manuscripts start appearing in the 2nd century BCE in Egypt. And we also know that the style of Greek, the time period where we can see change within the Greek language, fits the 3rd century BCE for the Pentateuch. Do we know it's Egypt? Not for absolute certainty, but for high probability. Firstly, we have Egyptian loanwords in the Greek. So the translators knew Egyptian words. They seem to also know words which aren't unique to Egypt, but are typical of the administrative language in Egypt at the time. So the internal linguistic evidence points to Egypt. Secondly, the community in Egypt. What do we know about the Jewish community in Egypt? Well, the community in Egypt, we now have much more evidence than we did before. We have inscriptions which show, even as early as the 3rd century BCE, Jews building prayer houses. And if you have a prayer house, it means you have a community large enough to need a prayer house. You also have a community wealthy enough to build a prayer house. And these prayer houses have inscriptions on which are in Greek. So we can see them using Greek. More recently, we've discovered papyri, which are tax registers from the 3rd century BCE. Now, tax registers are the most boring things to read. It's mostly a list of names. But what's intriguing about these particular tax registers, the so-called salt tax papyri, is it's a list of people who are exempt from tax if they class themselves as Hellenes, that is to say, Greeks. And we have some 300 names, approximately, 200 to 300 names, that seem to be either Semitic or Jewish, all registered as Hellenes from one region. This suggests that Jews actually were becoming Hellene, which means Greek in some way. This means they've been through some sort of Greek education. Therefore, we have a large enough community in Egypt already in the 3rd century BCE, and a community knowing Greek and engaging with Greek life in the 3rd century BCE. So that seems the most likely place and time for the translation.
So actually what you're saying, that even the Jews who lived in Egypt, maybe in Alexandria, needed this translation to understand the Bible, right? Because probably the spoken language was Greek.
Yes. What we see in Egypt is a very complex linguistic situation. The Greeks arrive, and they're actually quite small in number. And the first thing that happens is that they need scribes to run the administration across Egypt. This had been done for centuries by Egyptians, and especially Egyptian priests who were the ones engaged in literacy and knew the language. And in the 3rd century, because there weren't enough Greeks, the Egyptians continued to do the administration, and they wrote in Egyptian. But the Greeks didn't like that because they couldn't read Egyptian, so they required some things to be written in Greek. And in no time at all, we have bilingual Egyptians knowing both Egyptian and Greek and writing documents in Greek. The best way to make money was to learn Greek under a Greek administration. So that Greek became an important language. Then when we put the Jews in the same picture, actually, it's highly likely that Jews started learning Greek for business purposes and for administration. It doesn't mean they entirely lost their knowledge of Hebrew, which is sometimes presented that Jews immediately didn't know Hebrew, so they started learning Greek. What it seems more likely is that once you get a second generation, they are more competent in Greek than in Hebrew, even if they still study Hebrew in school or speak Hebrew at home. Greek is the dominant language of Egypt and the one where you make money. So it's quite possible there was a kind of ideological development which encouraged the use of Greek, and political and sociological reasons for using Greek. And therefore, Greek became the language that Jews were most natural using, and therefore used a translation. But it does mean also that actually Jews could read and write Greek to a high level. Sometimes when people look at the translation, they look at the language and say the language is not very good, or the language shows influence from Hebrew, because of course it's a translation. But people often then say, but the translation was done very badly. And this is a misrepresentation. Jews would, as other people in Egypt, have known Greek to a high level. And when we think they've written what some people say is bad Greek, it's more that it's not at the highest literary level, but it's actually also because it's a translation, and all translations show interference from the Hebrew. That is to say, they follow the Hebrew word order, for example. So the loss of Hebrew is not the only story for the reason why Jews need a translation. It's also because this was the cultural language of the time and was the language which most people spoke.
Professor Aitken, what happened after the Pentateuch was translated?
So far I've only spoken about the Pentateuch and its origins in the 3rd century BCE. What becomes interesting is that gradually other translations are produced. And this seems to have taken a long time, anything up to the 1st century CE. So for example, probably our latest translation in the Septuagint is the translation of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. And we can tell this by the style of translation. I'll come back to style in a moment. Kohelet or Ecclesiastes seems to be translated as late as the 1st century CE, which may be because actually it wasn't being used very much or wasn't seen as important enough to translate until that period. So translation tells us something about the importance of different texts. At the same time, as well as the books of the Hebrew Bible were being translated, there were other books being translated. So, for example, the Book of Enoch, we have some samples of its translation in Greek. The Book of Jubilees we know was translated, although we don't have much of that translation preserved. And then there are other books which were preserved in Judaism. Sometimes we only now have them in Greek, like 4th Esdras. Sometimes we might only have them in a later language, like Slavonic or Syriac. But this shows that actually many books in Jewish tradition were being translated. At the same time, the translation style varied, so that the Pentateuch was translated in a fairly natural way. We then get translations being done in 2 different directions. One direction was more literary translation. So the Book of Proverbs, a really challenging and engaging book to read in Hebrew, was then translated in Greek in an engaging way, where often the Proverbs were changed and rewritten into a more Greek format. Secondly, another translation style was that moving much more closely towards the Hebrew. So some books, such as Lamentations or Song of Songs, were translated in a way that represented the Hebrew far more carefully, so that they follow the word order of the Hebrew, always represented one Hebrew word with one particular Greek word, and always tried to match the number of Hebrew words with the number of Greek words, which makes it a slightly difficult and strange translation to make. So we can imagine 2 streams of translation, or 2 schools, one becoming more literary and a little freer in its translation, and the other becoming much more closely representing the Hebrew. Interestingly, we see the same things with the Targum, the Aramaic Targum, where you have onkelos following much more closely the Hebrew, and then something like pseudo-Jonathan going in the other direction. So that it's not unknown that you get these different translation methods. Amongst all that as well, we then have the issue that some people weren't very happy with the first translations and started revising them. So we then start to see revisions of translation. So when we talk about the Greek translation of a Hebrew work, we're often talking about more than one. So for example, the Minor Prophets, we have what probably is the first translation of the Minor Prophets in the Septuagint, and then we have a manuscript of the Minor Prophets found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls in Nachar Hever, in the cave of Nachar Hever, which actually follows much more closely the Hebrew than the original translation, and makes some changes to match both the Hebrew text of the time that was available to the reviser, and also to match a consistent choice of Greek words.
What influence had this translation on the development of Christianity, development of our world, we can say?
Yes. I mean, it's fascinating if we think about it. This is the first religious tradition really building itself up on translation. The fact that Jews were willing to translate so many texts shows they weren't against or had any difficulties with reading their texts in translation. When Christianity came along, because they had then adopted this text, not necessarily knowing it was a translation, but they saw the text as very, very important. What we see in early Christianity, if we start with the New Testament, the first thing is the New Testament is written in Greek, but it's often modeled on the language style of the Septuagint. So that there are phrases in the Septuagint which would be not normal in Greek, but reflect literal representations of the Hebrew. And those Greek phrases then influence the New Testament. So some of the writing style of the New Testament, particularly of the early Gospels, that style of the Gospels is a style that is typical of really a translated text, even when they are not. Next, we have the fact that they often quote the Septuagint. And this becomes interesting because they don't always quote the Septuagint that we have. It may be one of those revised versions that I've mentioned, or revised versions which we don't actually have anymore, but we can see is a revision. So it's quite possible the authors chose which translation, which of the many versions of the translation that existed, they chose which was best for their particular argument. And in fact, it's quite possible they were aware of variants and that there were different versions. But finally, of course, the Septuagint, in translating into Greek from Hebrew, the Septuagint sometimes had to choose a particular word which would have a different vocabulary from the Hebrew. A good example is, let's start with the word nefesh, which in Hebrew means life or neck or breath. And in Greek, the Septuagint translators translated this as psyche, which is the origins of the word psyche and psychology. This word was a reasonable translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew has various meanings and the Greek has various meanings, and so they match up quite nicely by being quite flexible, polysemous, as we say, having multiple meanings. And so there was no necessarily intention by the translators. But when someone came along and read it in Greek, they then, when you see the word psyche, you then think of Plato, who wrote much about psyche as the soul that escapes the body in the afterlife. And the true philosopher releases his earthly body by meditation and allowing his soul to go to heaven. This laid the foundation, firstly in Judaism, for beliefs in the afterlife. So Wisdom of Solomon, which is a Greek Jewish philosophical work, wrote much about the afterlife and the soul. And Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century, mentioned already, he also wrote about this idea of the release of the soul. And so that when we come to Christianity, there's a great focus on ideas of the afterlife in Christianity from this very almost accidental or unintentional translation of Nefesh by Psuche. A second example, most famously, is of course the issue over the virgin birth. Isaiah 7 talks about an alma, a maiden, which was translated into Greek as Parthenos, which can also mean just a maiden or a young girl or an unmarried woman, but also has a specific meaning in Greek of virgin. Now, this may have been, again, unintentional in the translation of Isaiah, but once it was read in Greek and people saw the word as virgin, it then created the story of the virgin birth. So those two examples are two examples of how we can see the translation, once it was read in Greek, separate from the Hebrew and by people who didn't necessarily think about the Hebrew background, it started to develop its own theological influence.
Historically, from a Jewish perspective, was it the right move to translate this Hebrew text into the Greek and eventually helping for the Christianity to rise and rule the world? What do you think?
Yes, one could argue it did pave the way for Christianity to use the language of the world, which could be negative for Judaism or could be positive in other respects. One could debate that. But for the Jews themselves, when the translation was produced, we need to think about these are Jews living in new lands. They've moved out of Judah. They're in the Mediterranean. This gave them their establishment and their identity within the Mediterranean world. Some people speak about it as that it's an identity of resistance, that you're translating into Greek, but the Greek is preserving some elements of that Hebrew through this language interference in the Greek. But I don't see it that way. Rather, I see it as reflective of the Jews being self-confident in their environment. They're writing in Greek because they were feeling entirely Greek. And in actual fact, what we see with the Septuagint is then, based upon it, a whole range of Jewish Greek literature, including, shockingly, a Greek tragedy based on the Passover story. Perhaps it was celebrated on Pesach. You would actually have a Greek tragedy performed. And ancient writings, poetry, and stories and novels, all written by Jews in Greek and often influenced by the language of the Septuagint or using the stories of the Septuagint. This meant that Jews in the ancient world were really part of a Greek cultural environment. And so for them it was essential. If they didn't translate the Hebrew writings, they wouldn't have had a sacred text or an authority to work from. So the translation was essential. They could have written poems or plays, but it wouldn't have then been based on the religious tradition. But by being based on the religious tradition, they could remain religious and yet be fully participating in the Greek culture.
And Professor, from a Christian point of view, without this translation, would Christianity prevail like it did? Would it be a different religion, maybe? Maybe
a different religion. Very hard to say. If let's do some counterfactual history. If the translation was never made, the Christian movement would have been speaking Aramaic, and they probably would have, therefore, in terms of a tradition, may well have merely stayed in the area of Syria, Transjordan, Judah, as Aramaic speakers. By having Greek, they were able to spread into Asia Minor, into Greece, and ultimately to Rome. So certainly without Greek, Christianity would not have had the dominance it had now. Maybe they would have done their own translation, or maybe eventually some people would speak Greek. But if you were speaking Greek, but you're speaking Greek about a text that is Hebrew, it wouldn't make sense at all. So they needed something in Greek if they were going to use that text. Without the text, they are no longer a people of the book. They would be a small cultic group who may well have actually died out when the temple was destroyed, because they were temple-focused initially, the early Christian movement. And if you lose the temple and you don't have a religious text to continue the message, then you may not have lasted. So there's much truth in saying, actually, the Septuagint translation paved the way for Christianity.
Professor Aitken, actually content-wise, what Hebrew text was in front of these translators? What we can know about it? How it differs from the classical Masoretic text which we have now as a Hebrew Bible?
What we can see on one level is that they had a text that was reasonably close to the Masoretic text, but still had a number of differences. We can already see that in the revision tradition. So if we looked at the Minor Prophets, we see the revision manuscript from the 1st century BCE is much closer to the Masoretic text than the first translation done in the 2nd century BCE. So it already gives us an idea that the Masoretic tradition was becoming more known by the 1st century than the 2nd century. In terms of the first books, the Pentateuch in the 3rd century BCE, there we see a number of differences. But some of those differences actually also appear in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Greek is also a witness that the Samaritan Pentateuch was much more than just amongst the Samaritans. We also find that many of the manuscripts match with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is no surprise, because if we think of the translations being done in the 3rd to 1st century BCE, much of the Dead Sea Scrolls are 2nd to 1st century BCE. So it's the very same time period. So it does reflect a Hebrew text of the time, but not a text that has been fully shaped into what becomes the Masoretic text.
So we have currently a number of texts, which a number of different texts. And what is the, I don't know if the right word is ideology, or how can you characterize the Septuagint? Was any special idea behind this text?
When we look at the Septuagint, I think we need to imagine one translator working with one Hebrew text, whichever Hebrew text he had in front of him. I don't necessarily mean he worked alone. Intellectual communities were small in antiquity, and people would have known each other. They probably had discussed the text before they translated it. One of the interesting things when we look at the translation, there's a large consistency in translation method and choice of vocabulary, how they translated one Hebrew word into Greek. So there clearly was some sort of community understanding of how to read the Hebrew. In terms of ideology, when that translator is sitting and looking at the text, much of the time he seems to be just trying to find the best way to translate the Hebrew. So there isn't always a long-term theological or ideological goal, but there seems to be a need to try and explain each passage in its own terms. Let me give firstly some narrative examples. When Joseph becomes in charge of Egypt in Genesis, we then start to see various vocabulary items used in Genesis of Joseph that reflect Egypt of its time. So Joseph becomes, in Greek, a toparch, toparchis in Greek, which is the technical term for someone who is a governor of a local region in Egypt. And then when you get titles like those in Pharaoh's court, like the chief baker and the chief butler, you have terms which do mean chief butler and chief baker, but are also terms used in the Ptolemaic court. So the narrative in Egypt is shaped in an Egyptian fashion. Similarly, when we get the story of Moses in Egypt, we get a number of Egyptian words, including Moses' basket, so-called basket, which in Hebrew is the word for ark, which you also see in Noah's Ark. In the Moses story is the Egyptian word for container or box. So they've chosen a word that's distinctively Egyptian. It's also in the Moses story, particularly when it describes Moses as a child and growing up, that it uses a Greek that's a little more literary, a little bit more storytelling style of Greek. It begins, there was a man, but in a way that's so typical of starting a story in Greek. So that you can see that on the simple level of just trying to convey the narrative, there are times when the translator is sensitive to the material and includes that. There are other more technical things the translator does. The translator tackles the problem of numbers, that's to say of the ages of the various generations, which don't quite match up in Hebrew, so the translator finds a way of trying to find the numbers matching up. There are times also where the translator is more sensitive to the presentation of God, so that instead of saying, I saw God, the translator in Exodus talks about seeing the place where God stood. So a careful, gentle theological avoidance of directly seeing God. There are other times where the translation just seems to be reading the Hebrew in a way that other people at the time would read the Hebrew, and is not the way a scholar of the 21st century would read it. So at times we see the translator seeming to produce a translation that looks a little odd, but is actually merely a translator writing in the form of Hebrew of its day, which often is Hebrew influenced by the Aramaic language. So there are times where different meanings are given, but they're not necessarily intentional changes, but just how the community at the time read the Hebrew Bible, which itself is very interesting for understanding the development of the language at the time.
If we look on the Masoretic version of the Hebrew Bible, and we compare it to the text of Septuagint, do we find any new information, any new stories, any new details which we do not find in Masoretic text?
We do, in fact, but in two different directions. In one direction, we sometimes find the Greek is much shorter than the Hebrew in a way that may well suggest that the Greek is earlier in terms of translating a Hebrew text that is shorter than our current text. We see this in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, for example. In Jeremiah, the text behind the Septuagint is much shorter. And this raises questions, actually. When we write commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, shouldn't we really be starting with writing commentaries on the shorter version of the Hebrew as it's reflected in the Greek? An interesting example of this is also, for example, in the Book of Kings, where we have the presentation of Solomon. At times, some of the more positive elements used of Solomon are in the Hebrew, but not in the Greek, which may mean that actually the Hebrew has been developed over time as a positive reading of Solomon that was less positive in the original version, which tells us much about the early history writing and the much more strong critique of kings, which we know in biblical history anyway. And the Greek is evidence, therefore, of a much earlier version of the Hebrew. The other direction is where parts have been added in Greek. And this actually we only see in some places, but we see it, for example, in the book of Esther. Book of Esther famously doesn't mention God, but there are whole passages which have been added to Esther in the Greek, some of which might have been written in Greek, but some of which look like they've been translated from a Hebrew version. And they mention God. So someone's put God into Esther in the Greek version. They also develop the personality of Queen Esther in much more detail, making her a much more interesting female figure.
So you mentioned often that the translation is actually following closely the Hebrew. Is it a distinctive to this translation?
The translation proceeds in two ways. Some translators become more literary and try to present the translation in a more natural Greek way, but other translators, as I've mentioned, seem to take it in the other direction and representing the Hebrew more closely. They follow the Hebrew word order, they follow the same Hebrew word with the same Greek word, and they reflect the Hebrew idiom even in Greek. This has led some people to say this is a bad translation method and even bad Greek. But we need to think about it differently. Why are they doing it this way? What they're actually doing is setting up a tradition which we see continuing in Judaism for many, many centuries of the interest in representing the Hebrew in Greek. For some people, this may represent just the sacrality of Hebrew, that Hebrew is becoming more sacred, and one could even compare it, as Martin Goodman has done, with the attention to Hebrew scrolls. In the Mishnah, it says how a Hebrew scroll has to be written on parchment and must be written in square script, not in Samaritan script, and so on. So the physicality of a scroll is developing. And so the language of Greek representing Hebrew is a sort of physicality of representing a sacred object. However, I think there are other reasons as well. One may well be an interest in grammar, and the Septuagint may give us the first evidence of Hebrew grammatical tradition, because they always represent nouns by nouns and verbs by verbs and adjectives by adjectives. And if the adjective is feminine, they will sometimes invent a feminine adjective in Greek. So there's a real intention to present grammatically accurately the Hebrew. Another interest, I think, is if the Septuagint was produced in learned circles, then a literal translation representing everything carefully sometimes requires someone who knows both the Hebrew and the Greek at the same time to understand it. And one can see it as a linguistic play, so that to see what a Greek word means when it doesn't seem to represent normal Greek, you may well need to understand the Hebrew at the same time, and therefore it requires a learned audience. And there are examples where they are using grammatical forms both in Hebrew and in Greek at the same time. I'll give you one example. To mark the object in Hebrew, you have a little word, the word et, which is untranslatable because it's really a grammatical marker. What we see eventually in the Greek of Ecclesiastes, and then in a later Jewish translator called Aquila, this word et represented by a Greek word with. And the oddity about this is that firstly, et, which can mean with in classical Hebrew, et disappears in the language in Hebrew with that meaning of with. And yet, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the translators know that meaning. So they have to be scholars of Hebrew to know that there was a meaning with for this similar looking object marker. Secondly, the word they use to translate with in Greek is also disappearing from the language. And in actual fact, I think the way they're using it, without going into details, is based on Homer's use of this word for with. So the translators know both advanced Hebrew to know an obsolete form of Hebrew, and also know advanced Greek to know an obsolete form of Greek, which actually reflects the usage in Homer. So that's an example where you need to know both languages, and both languages at a high level to do this. So there's an intellectual game going on with the translators in doing that. And that particular example is very interesting because we even find people in Judeo-Arabic some 800 years later still trying to represent this object marker in Hebrew, in Arabic. So that this attention to the details of the Hebrew language, I think, is very distinctive of the Septuagint and the Septuagint tradition, but establishes something that continues much longer in Jewish tradition.
Since this translation was done and presented to the world, what changes were done? Can we tackle down these changes? What is the oldest text which we have now? And how this text was developed, if at all?
I think it's important to begin with the development within Judaism, which is often overlooked. Partly there's a tradition that, coming from Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, a Christian writer who just wrote a disputation with a Jew, where they debate over the translation. And it seems as if the Jew, in the words of the Christian, is disagreeing with the Septuagint because the Christians are using it for their own theological message. So from that, there's a tradition that Jews stopped using the Septuagint. But we need to point to some pieces of evidence that we have. Firstly, before that period, our earliest manuscripts begin in the 2nd century BCE, just very small copies, very small fragments of the Septuagint, and it continues to be copied. In the 2nd century CE, we then have some Jewish translators. Aquila famously made it very literal, Symmachus, another one who made it perhaps a little more rabbinic in its orientation, a little more exegetical. So in the 2nd century CE, we already have Jews making their own revisions of the first translation. But then we have ongoing references to being used amongst Jews. Firstly, here in the Cairo Geniza, we have a Greek text in Hebrew characters that seems to be based on the Septuagint, but with some modifications, that's being used perhaps in the synagogue as late as the 8th or 9th century. And this is because, of course, Jews in Greece and the Byzantine Empire would continue to use Greek. So actually the Septuagint was perhaps still being used in the medieval period amongst Jews. We even have the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century intervening in a dispute in a synagogue. It doesn't say where the synagogue is, but probably in Byzantium, over whether to use a Hebrew version or a Greek version. Namely, do they use the Septuagint itself, the original Septuagint, or do they use Aquila's version? And the emperor decrees they should use Aquila's version, probably because it looks a bit like the Hebrew but is actually Greek. So it pleases both parties, the Hebraists and the Hellenists in a sense. So we can see Jews were continuing to use the Septuagint for some time, a story often forgotten. For the Christians, when they start using it, they make copies, of course, such that we now have thousands of copies in reality. But it's often produced in codices, and such as Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, three great 4th and 5th century codices of the early church, where we see this wonderfully neatly laid out Septuagint ready for study or for liturgical purposes. Although the problem with these codices, they don't always seem to have been used very much. So we don't know what the big codices were used for. But many other copies were being made. And at the same time, revisions, which we've already mentioned in the Jewish tradition, revisions continued. So there was one tradition of Lucian in the 3rd century who didn't actually like the Greek style of the Septuagint and tried to write it in a little more literary style of Greek and use more classical Greek words, which were favored in his time period. There's even someone who, it is reported, is said to have tried to rewrite some of the Septuagint in the style of Homer in hexameter poems. So that people are continuing to use it and continuing to change it according to their literary preferences.
Professor James Aitken, it's a great honor for us to have you on our channel. I think it's a big achievement for our channel to have such a great scholar with this fascinating information. Thank you very much.
And thank you.